So welcome to this ELSP webinar on publishing your results and navigating open access publication. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nancy Ockenden. I'm the science manager on the ELSP, and it's great to have so many of you here today. So really the purpose of today's webinar is that we know there's loads of fantastic data collection and work going on to kind of improve our understanding of ecosystem restoration that's going on across the programme all the time. And as a programme, we really want to encourage you to share those results and that understanding that you're building. And that's got to be in the most appropriate way. So that may be kind of sharing via conversations with landowners or producing reports for policymakers. But in many cases, it's also really important to submit your results to peer-reviewed scientific journals. But I'm really aware that this can be a challenge. It can be really time-consuming, and it can be really difficult to know where to start with thinking about how to prepare and submit your results to journals. So it can be difficult to identify the best journal and to prepare your manuscript. In addition, there are real kind of barriers and challenges about costs of publication. And that can be really quite off-putting. We really want our results to be available to everybody, but the journal system can make it quite difficult to understand how best to achieve this. So I'm really delighted today that we have two speakers that are really going to talk about how best to navigate these processes and ensure that the great work you're all doing has the best chance of being published and read by anyone who might be interested. Our first speaker is Martin Fisher, who's the editor of Oryx, which is an international journal for nature conservation. And Martin's going to be talking to us about how to publish your work, prepare and publish your work in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. We're then going to go on and hear from Ross Mounts, who is the Director of Open Access at Arcadia, our funders. Ross will speak about open access, why it's important, and how you as an author can maintain control of the articles that you're writing. I really hope that we have lots of questions and lots of opportunity for you to ask those. So we'll have time after the presentations for people to ask questions, ideally by raising your hand, but if it's easier to put questions in the chat box, please do that and we can raise them. So I think I'll now hand over to Martin to talk to us a bit about how to improve your chances of getting your work published. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Nancy. And the other staff of the programme, and it's very nice to meet everybody today in this way. I am, as Nancy said, Martin Fisher. I work for Fauna and Flora. I've worked for them for over 20 years, and my principal task is to be the editor-in-chief of Oryx, the International Journal of Conservation. And Nancy has asked me to talk to you today to encourage you to consider publishing your work in a peer-reviewed journal. It doesn't have to be the journal I edit, it can be any other journal, of course. To encourage you to publish in the peer-reviewed literature, and has asked me to say a few things to give you some tips and tricks, if you like, to help you choose a journal, to help you do your writing, to help you present your work in the best way so that you can convey your messages as clearly as possible to national or international readerships. There's a lot I could say about this, but I'm only going to talk to you for about 20 minutes, and I'm happy to fill in the gaps, so to speak, by responding to your questions after my talk. I hope that's okay. Nancy and anybody else, if there's anything goes wrong or you want to ask me something as we go along, that's also okay. Just let me know. Right. Publishing your work in the peer-reviewed literature. This is the material I'm going to cover. I'm going to ask why you should publish your work in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm going to discuss the structure, or the anatomy as I call it, of an article in the peer-reviewed literature. I will touch briefly on three parts of the anatomy, the titled abstract and keywords, because I can't go into detail about everything in 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about helping you encourage to write, to try and encourage you to write by considering using a key message framework to help you put your writing together. I'm going to talk a little bit about the correct use of graphics and tables. I will briefly discuss the publication process, I will talk about choosing the best journal for your fantastic work. I'll ask whether you should be publishing your work in one article or splitting it over several. And then I shall give you a little bit of further guidance and resources. And finally, at the end, my top 10 tips to get your work into a peer-reviewed journal. Okay, so first of all, why publish in a peer-reviewed journal? I've got several reasons here that I'd like to present to you, but probably the most important are the first two. You don't just want to hide your work away. You've done some fantastic work. You've received funding for it. You've been at it for several years. So you really want to share this knowledge, both with your immediate colleagues, friends, family, but also with people in your country and, importantly, perhaps internationally. So it's the principal way that you can share your work. There are other ways, of course. You will write reports, you will use email, you will talk to people, but by sharing your work in the peer-reviewed literature, you'll be communicating it to many people across the world, and also it will be there forever and ever. So, in 100 years' time, hopefully people will still be able to read your work, as long as the internet is still switched on. It also helps to increase the impact of your work. Obviously, you don't just want people to read your work, you'd like them to use the work, your findings and recommendations to improve the conservation and ecosystem and environmental science work that they are doing. So by publishing your work and communicating it, you can increase the impact and its use. It's also good to contribute to scholarship. Generally, it can be good for your professional development. You've received funding, perhaps, for doing the work. Sometimes it's a condition of funding to publish your work in the peer-reviewed literature. Underestimated reasons for publishing in the peer-reviewed literature is it can help to improve your writing, and it can help the critiques that you receive from peer review can both help improve that piece of writing and also your future piece of writings as well. So don't be afraid of the peer review process. It's generally a very positive thing. You will have done a lot of work of different types. You'll have one or more data sets. You'll have your analyses. You'll have some details about where you worked. You will have your interpretation. You'll have your discussion. You'll have your conclusions, your recommendations. One of the principal challenges that people face often, I find, is to get all those disparate different parts of information into the right place. So, for example, your methods only contains methods, your results only contains results, and your discussion only contains discussion. That seems quite obvious, but one thing that people do struggle with often is to ensure that their results section only contains a description of their results and doesn't stray into the discussion of their results. It sounds simple, but it can, once you get down to the details of writing, it can be a little bit challenging. That, for a standard article, on the left-hand side, you'll see there the main parts, and on the right-hand side, you'll see all the other little parts that most journals will probably require, including things like whether you've got any conflicts of interest, whether you've abided by the ethical standards that the journal requires, whether you're making your data available publicly. Those are all important details that you need to think about and include in your article. As I said, I'm not going to go through the complete anatomy today, but I would just like to say a few things about the title, abstract, and keywords, because you'll probably finalize these three items of an article when you finish the main writing. But in many ways, they are the most important things to get right. Because when people do a search on Google or Web of Science to try and find research on the subjects they're interested in, the first thing they will encounter about your work or your article is the title. So an attractive title, well, let me put it a different way. The title is your first way of enticing people in to read your article. Okay, so they're going to meet your title first. So an attractive title can be quite helpful. Some people go along, use a catchy title that sounds so interesting, such as Fantastic Beasts and Why to Conserve Them. Animals, Magic and Biodiversity Conservation. So that's a really attractive and interesting title that might entice readers to read your work. In practice, a catchy title of that type can be very difficult to make it work correctly. And you might want to use a more simple title, such as How Should Conservation Be Professionalized, which contains the research question, or River dolphins are on the path to extinction. There we see the conclusion of the article displayed in the title. These are different ways that you can go. I'll just make two general points. You don't want your title to be too long, and you want to try and use your title to entice both a broad or a general and a specific audience, so that you can maximize your readership. For your interest there, the numbers in red next to each title are to date the number of times these articles have been viewed online. They're all articles published in Oryx. So you see that Fantastic Beasts and Why to Conserve Them has been viewed 8,500 times, and it has an altmetric score of 129. The altmetric score is a measure of how much attention the article has received in blogs, whether it's been covered in news items, whether people have mentioned it on Twitter. Let's go. The abstract, I'll just say a little bit about the abstract, because if people read your title and they like it, the next thing they're going to do is to read your abstract. In your abstract, you want to provide some context, state your hypothesis and aim. Where did you do the research? You need to present your results, and you need to summarize the implications of your findings. That may seem like quite a challenge in 200 or 250 words. In the next slide, I'll show you how it can work out. The things you don't want to do in your abstract is to distract your readers by citing any references because they have no relevance in an abstract, or by giving any statistics. That's not necessary. Just to show you how it can work out, here's an abstract which I've coded according to context, or if you like, the why people, the general background, research need, why you've done this work, the methods you used, the results you gathered, and, if you like, the discussion, conclusions and recommendations, all in a couple of sentences in yellow there at the end. So that's what you're aiming for. It comes from an actual, from a recently published article, just to give you an overview of how it's like a mini view of the anatomy of your article condensed into about 200 words. The next thing you should consider getting as correct as you can are the keywords. The most important thing I'd like to say about getting a good selection of keywords with your article is to search engine optimize them. That is to ensure that your keywords will be picked up by search engines, principally Google. You want to select between 6 and 8 keywords and to distribute them evenly, not evenly, but regularly throughout your article, in the title, the abstract, in the keywords, and throughout the different sections of your text. I'll give you a resource later to talk about how to do that in a little bit more detail. But your aim here is to, when someone does a search on Google, you want your article to appear on the first page, not on the 10th page or the 20th page. And by search engine optimizing your keywords, you can ensure that will happen. A mixture of general and specific keywords is most helpful. And sometimes people might suggest to you that keywords in the title should not be repeated in the keywords themselves. That's old-fashioned advice. Nowadays, we want to see those keywords repeated everywhere to search engine optimize your article. Writing can be a challenge. How do you even begin? And I think the best way I found to give advice to people on this is to advise people to use a key Yeah, there's a mistake there. That should be the key message framework, not the key framework message. My apologies. So it's to use a key message framework. So once you've collected your data and done your analysis, you will probably have one or two or more key messages that you want to communicate to your readers. And each of those messages will almost certainly be supported by a table and or a figure. Okay, so once you've got your data organized into tables and figures and you've done your analysis, consider what are your key messages. And then you're going to structure your methods and your results around those key messages. And once you've done that, it's going to be much more easy. It's going to be easier to write, in particular, your discussion, which for many people is the greatest challenge when writing an article for the peer-reviewed literature. Okay. And in your writing, especially in your results, you are going to lead your readers through the framework, summarizing your main findings, clarifying and drawing attention to points of interest, in particular things like differences between categories in your data, for example. One of the main things that I found authors tend to struggle with is how best to present their data and their analyses in graphics and in tables. So what I've done, or what we've done at Oryx, is we've put together a guide to this. It's called Writing for Conservation, and I'll give you a few more details about it at the end of my short talk. In that guide, I present a framework. I love frameworks, and I present a framework for graphics to help people structure their graphics nicely so that the messages that a graphic conveys is brought to the front. It clearly can be visible. It's clearly visible in a graphic, and the things that are not of such great interest, more peripheral, are at the back or at the sides of the graphic. So in that simple map that you see there, the principal thing that the author wants to convey here is the location of the forest. So it's in green and it's got the largest text label. And that text label is also in green. Okay, and the white dots are the places where they collected some seeds, in fact. So, but you notice that the text on the scale bar in the sort of bottom left and the latitude and longitude tick mark labels, those are all in a much smaller font, which pushes them to the sides, and they're not part of the key message, the main message. So that's just a way of bringing out that key message rather than having everything in the same font size, so the key message is not so clearly communicated. Another thing to think about is to use intuitive design. So forest is green, so use a green color to label the forest, okay, and to draw the forest. That's a simple illustration of intuitive design. And the other thing you want to think about is you want your figure to be interpretable, to be understandable without reference to the text. Let's look at a specific map, and here I've chosen possibly the most complicated map, the figure that we've published in the journal in recent years. It contains a lot of information. It contains a main map, and it contains 3 sub-maps, A, B, and C, which are, and there's some rectangles on the main map indicating where they are. So although it contains a lot of information, the author has here followed this idea of a graphics framework and managed to present a very complicated set of data, but still it's in a very clear map. And it also has some other nice things in it. There's some semi-transparency in the figure so that we can see the landforms, so that we can see where the more mountainous or hilly regions are, which I think is also quite useful. The main map elements you want to make sure you've got on your map are an inset map, which is at a different scale, which shows the location of the main map, and you see that intuitively presented in the bottom left-hand corner. There's no arrows or anything there, just a grey rectangle, which it's self-explanatory, I think, that rectangle shows the location of the main map in Brazil. There's a scale bar, there are some labels, there's no north arrow. We're often taught in school to put a north arrow on a map. I think for a map that you're not using to navigate, I think that's not required. We've got some eastings and some southings, so to speak, to indicate the latitude and longitude, and I think that's sufficient. Generally, you're only going to be able to produce a map that a journal is going to consider suitable if you use GIS software. If you do some screenshots from online maps and so on, it's not going to be of sufficient quality. The other thing to consider is accessibility. There's a lot of people out there with various forms of red, green, or other color blindness, and there are various websites you can go to check whether the color palette you're using for your figure is suitable for people with the various types of color blindness. So that's to help our brothers and sisters who have that problem. That's a good thing to consider. For data plots, you can also follow the graphics framework. Again, pushing the things of lesser interest to the side and bringing out the more important things. Probably one of the main things I'd like to say here is to consider carefully the software that you use for drawing your data plots. If you try to draw your data plots in Excel, you will really struggle to produce data plots that is both going to convey your message or your purpose clearly, and that a journal is going to accept. My two favorite pieces of software are ggplot2, which is part of R, or if you don't like R because of its complexity, there's a very simple piece of menu-driven software called Views, freely available, which you'll be easily able to find online. And then some of these figures on this page have been produced with R, and some of them have been produced with Views. The only other thing I'd like to say is, please, I would advise you to avoid using pie charts in your data, because the human eye is a very poor judge of the proportional comparisons between the segments of a circle. And that, in our Writing for Conservation guide, there's some nice illustrations of why pie charts are not suitable. Sometimes you want to include photographs. That's a useful thing to do as long as the photographs, or plates as they will be called in a journal article, are part of the evidence. So in the top figure there's a camera trap photograph, which is part of the evidence of the author's work. So that's a natural thing to include in the article. Tables. The main thing I'd like to urge you to recall or remember when you're drawing up your tables is that people read generally, at least in English, from left to right. Okay, not from top to bottom. They're going to read your table from left to right and then top to bottom. So in general, as a general rule, your items, in this case, the top line, for example, is the number of camera stations. So the items, the number of camera stations in 2019 and 2020, in this case, are in the top row. And then all the other items read from left to right. You may want to have some subheadings in your table, which is great. Here, the author has simply used a bold font to indicate the subheadings within the table. Footnotes are useful to use on tables, probably with some superscripted letters or numbers indicating what they reference. In the columns there with numbers, you'll see that for most of them, where they require decimal places, they've all got the same number of decimal places, which is 2. Okay, you don't want some with 1 or some with 3 or 4. It looks untidy, and it And it also means that the readers will not be sure exactly how much error there is in, or variability there is in your data. Okay, that's a little bit about your article. I'd like to say something about the publication process. It can be quite long, it can be quite complex. It's broken into 4 stages. Submission, when you submit your work to the journal. Revision and editing, that's when you receive your work back from the journal and the editor will ask you to make a revision. The proofing, when the proof that's going to be published appears, and then finally publication. That's complex. The shaded boxes there indicate where you will be involved as an author. You will submit your manuscript. After peer review, which I'll talk about in a second, you will revise your manuscript if you've been asked to do that and it hasn't been rejected. Based on the feedback of the reviewers, you will then submit a revised manuscript. You will then probably check a copy edited version or an edited version of your work. Then you'll check the proof, and then finally it'll be published. I don't need to go into all these details here, but I've put them there so that people can go through them maybe at a later stage to familiarize themselves with the process. Happy to answer questions about that later. I mentioned peer review. Your article will be going through peer review, in which 1 or more, probably 2 or 3 colleagues or contemporaries will be critiquing your work and giving you some feedback and assessing its quality. There are different types of peer review. Excuse me, I've just got a cup of tea coming in. Thank you very much, Dominic. That's nice. Okay, the different types of peer review. Probably the most common are the first 2, single blind and double blind. Single blind is where the reviewers will know your identity as an author. Double blind is where you will not know the identity of the reviewers, and the reviewers will not know your identity. That's not that important, perhaps. Most people quite naturally favour double blind peer review. Again, there's some other types of peer review as well that you may come across, and I've put them in there for you to read about later. One of the things Nancy did ask me to speak about was choosing the best journal, or the most suitable journal for your work. And why is this important? Well, it's likely to ensure that you're going to be more likely accepted for publication, that your work can easily be located by the people who are likely to read it, that it's going to be read by the most relevant audience, and that it's going to have an impact where you want to have it to have an impact. So, for example, just to give you an easy example of this, every week I reject work that is really good, but really it's more suitable for an ecological journal. Okay, so I will reject that work very quickly and encourage the author to go and submit their work to an ecology journal, and I'll probably make a recommendation for a suitable journal. So consider carefully, is your work about conservation practice? There are journals specializing in conservation practice. Is your work about environmental conservation? Well, there's a journal called Environmental Conservation. Is your journal about ecology? Well, there's lots of great journals that specialize in ecology. So the problem you have is that there are hundreds of journals. Perhaps the best place to start might be with the reference list at the end of your article, okay? And speaking to colleagues and friends will help as well. You want to consider the geographical criteria, whether it's a local or a national or an international journal you want to use, the subject area, whether it's a specialist journal. So is your work really only going to be of interest to birds? Then you might consider Bird Conservation International, for example, rather than a more broad journal such as Oryx. How accessible do you want your work to be? Do you want it to be open access? I won't say anything about that because Ross is going to talk about it, but I certainly would encourage you to, if you can, publish in an open access journal, simply because it will increase your readership. There'll be no paywalls. Everybody everywhere with an internet connection will be able to read your article. Nancy asked me to talk about a common question that she gets asked, and that is, you've finished your project, you've done your analysis, should you publish your work in one giant paper or in 10 little papers or in 2 medium-sized papers? It's really difficult to give specific advice on this, but I would urge you not to artificially split your work into many different parts. I think if your work naturally falls into 2 parts, maybe one is about distribution and the other about behavior, then that might be 2 articles for 2 journals with different scopes. But in general, I think readers will appreciate having everything in one place. I think it might be better for your reputation as well, but I do recognise that there is some pressure on people to increase their citation scores according to various metrics by publishing more than 1 article. I try and minimise how much you split any one project between articles, however. Now I'm going to conclude by drawing your attention to a few resources. In our work at Oryx, myself and my team, we found that authors, whether it's first-time authors or authors publishing their 20th paper, they can struggle with various things. So what we've tried to do is collate all of our advice into one place, into our Writing for Conservation guide. It's freely available, accessible via our website. It covers writing, it covers graphics, there are some tutorials even on the basics of using GIS to draw maps and the basics of using graphics, software to produce data plots, how to manage your references using a bibliography manager, how to promote your writing through social and by search optimal article, the thing I mentioned earlier. We've also, on our website, you'll find a curated list of resources of free, mostly open source software that we recommend, that we found useful for us and for our authors. If you're struggling to find software, I urge you to look at that list. Finally, someone once asked me in a talk I gave, Martin, what are your top 10 tips for successful publication? They change over the years, but currently these are my top 10 tips. Okay. Before you actually start writing, do some planning. In particular, identify your main or key messages. These will form the framework for your writing, and I assure you it will make your writing easier. Don't use flowery, obtuse language. Write in direct, non-colloquial writing. So what do I mean by non-colloquial writing? So let's say the vast expanse of my study area. So saying the vast expanse is a bit more colloquial than saying my study area is 432 square kilometers. Okay, it's a science article. We want things to be specific. Plan your graphics to convey your messages clearly. Ensure that your co-authors, these days it's very rare for an article to have only 1 author, make sure all your co-authors are fully involved in the writing process. Use a bibliography manager so that you don't have what I call widows and orphans, where you have citations without references and references without citations. My principal recommendation would be to use Zotero, which is really the only source bibliography manager, and it stands head and shoulders above the others, in my opinion. It's freely available, you'll easily find it. Choose an appropriate journal, and most importantly, read the journal's instructions for contributors and follow them exactly. When you finish writing, ask someone else, your mother, your father, a colleague, a friend, a girlfriend, husband, wife, anybody. Ask someone else to read your article through. Someone who's not one of your co-authors, I would say, because they will help find your mistakes. And as a continuation of that, if I dare say it these days, print out your article on a piece of paper, on some paper, put it in an envelope and put it under your pillow and sleep on it for a week. Don't even think about it. Then come back and read it again. and you will find all sorts of errors, including simple things like you've used an outdated version of a table, or your figure is not really as good as it could be. Because when you're on top of your work and writing it, there's things you don't see. You need to let your brain sort things out. You'll thank me for that piece of advice and want to buy me a beer, I assure you. Include a covering letter with your submission, flattering the editor and the journal and explaining in some detail why you think your work is most suited to that journal. And it will show, well, first of all, it will force you to think about whether that journal is the most suitable journal. And it will also help the editor understand why you've chosen the journal. Finally, something that's very underappreciated: submit your work as soon as possible after you've completed it. Otherwise, you will struggle to write it up, and you may even struggle to get it published because you'll be told the work's too old. I would advise trying to submit your work within 12 months of finishing your work. It was rather quick and possibly even too long. My apologies, Nancy. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So that's me. I am Director of Open Access Programs at Arcadia. I've got subtitles on my presentation, just for extra accessibility. I thought what would be useful to explain, just to make sure we're all working off the same hymn sheet, is to explain exactly what open access is, because people don't always get it exactly correct. It's not just about being able to freely, without payment, access the results of research. It's also about reuse rights, so that you can reuse research and do text and data mining, and reuse in things like Wikipedia for educational reuse, printing off in a course pack in a classroom, things like that. So it's about free access, but also about reuse rights. So here's kind of a short form definition of open access. Open access literature is digital, online, free of charge, and free of most copyright and licensing restrictions. And I've put that second bit in bold because I think that's something we really mustn't forget. It's not just about making research free to access, it's also about making it reusable, legally reusable. This is kind of a much fuller definition and more precise definition of open access. It's called the BOAI definition. I'm not going to read it all out, but it's there on the slide, just if you really want to know what open access is. There's a really good book about open access as well, if you're interested. And the book itself is, of course, open access, so you don't have to pay to read it. I really recommend chapter 1 in this book, What is Open Access? It's published by MIT Press. It's a very, very good book. It's very authoritative. Another good question to ask ourselves is why we do open access. And it's because it's associated with a huge number of benefits. We don't do open access just for some religious reason. We do it because it's the best thing to do. It's social justice, it's good for interdisciplinarity, it's good for permitting translation, permits text and data mining, permits use by AI, permits citizen science, permits knowledge transfer. For medical research, it gives patient access. It's Wikipedia compliant, so you can reuse it in Wikipedia. On the other hand side of the slide, we've got a kind of infographic for researchers showing that it gives higher citation rates, more exposure for your work. The people who funded the research get more value for money. The general public can access your findings. They don't have to have a university affiliation. Open access just gives a wide panoply of benefits, and that's why open access to research is very important. Now, as to how to do open access, this is kind of a very complicated table, which I'm not really going to run through, so I'll just skip on to the next slide. The Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes program is an Arcadia funded program, and because it's Arcadia funded, that means it has to comply with the Arcadia open access policy. So that's kind of why I'm here today, to kind of tell you a little bit about that. And we don't mind how you do open access. We just want that the research at the end of it is made open access. And that can be done via an open access journal, or that can be done via open access repositories. So in kind of the first 3 bullet points, those are all repository-based open access means. So sharing preprints, sharing the manuscript in an institutional or disciplinary repository. And those last 4 are doing open access with a journal. whether it's a Diamond open access journal that's fee-free, or whether it's with fee-based journals, APC-based journals, or hybrid open access journal options are another way to go. But there's lots of different ways of making research open access, but it's your choice which way you choose. One way that I'd really advocate for making research open access is to use preprint servers to put up a preprint of your research before you submit it to the journal. So if you haven't encountered preprints before, I'll just try and explain here what they are. A preprint is a scientific manuscript that is uploaded by the authors to a public server. The preprint contains data and methods, but has not yet been accepted by a journal. Some servers perform brief quality control inspections, but it's not full peer review. So it's just making sure it's not anti-vax or racist or misogynist kind of screeds being published on the internet. Basic screening, but nothing more than that. So after you've submitted your preprint, it should be available after about 24 to 48 hours on the internet to anyone in the world. So it's a great way of making your research accessible rapidly before you submit it to a journal. Now, people often have a lot of concerns about the process of submitting preprints online. So you might ask yourself, are preprints compatible with journals? Yes, well, yes, they are. Both preprints and journal articles enable researchers to disseminate their findings to the research community, and they are complementary in that preprints represent an opportunity to disseminate at an early stage. In ecology, I don't really know of any journal that rejects manuscripts that have been preprinted before submission. You get occasionally, there's one or two medical journals that don't like it, but in ecology journals, it's generally been accepted that preprinting is the norm now. Another question you might ask yourself and your collaborators is, will I get scooped if I make my research available on a preprint server? And the answer to that is no. Because when your research is published on a preprint server, it establishes the priority for that research. You get a time-stamped digital object identifier and registered metadata, which shows your authorship of that research. So you can't really get scooped on it because it's out there and it's registered as yours. If anything, putting out a preprint early helps prevent scooping, as it gets your work out earlier than if you just waited to go through the long, drawn-out journal peer review process. Another question people might ask themselves is, will a preprint stop or deter publicity for my research? And all the evidence for that says no. Basically, tens of thousands of works have been preprinted and have received mainstream publicity. And, in the New York Times, in The Guardian, in Mongabay, wherever. Preprints don't stop publicity. We've got plenty of evidence to demonstrate that. There's also a paper recently being published on this, which you might find interesting to read, published in Quantitative Science Studies just like 10 days ago. A very interesting read. Another question you might want to ask yourself is can a preprint help my journal submission? And the answer to that is yes, because journals know about preprint servers. And so some of them use preprint servers to shop around for interesting manuscripts. And in some cases, some journals actually have editors that are actively scanning preprint servers for interesting manuscripts that they might like to publish in their journal. So you may, if you have a particularly interesting piece of research, have journals competing to publish your piece of research. And also, when you publish your research on a preprint server, you can get comments from other scholars around the world commenting on your experimental design, how you've done things. They may point out small errors, so you can improve your work before you submit it to the journal. So it's a way of widening the scope of and the variety of peer reviewers of your work. I kind of touched on this earlier, but as far as I'm aware, there are no ecology journals that reject pre-printed works at the submission stage. It could be that there is some kind of local journal published in Malaysia that doesn't like preprints, but of the mainstream journals and of the journals I know about, I'm not aware of any that reject pre-printed submissions. And some publishers, like for instance here, Springer Nature, are just very, very public that they encourage preprint posting. It's there on the Springer Nature website for all Springer Nature journals that they do not discriminate against preprints. So you need not have any fear about the process of preprinting. So options for uploading your preprint, particularly for the kind of ecology discipline, there's Evo Archive, there's Archive, there's BioArchive, there's preprints.org, there's OSF preprints, there's Cielo preprints. There's about 50 different preprint servers out there. And it's your choice which one you use. I mean, I recommend these 6. They're quite solid. They all provide a DOI. They all do a little bit of screening. They're all good preprint servers to use. What you can also do is ask a specific disciplinary community, a specific community of people to review your preprint before you submit it to a journal. So there's a peer community in ecology which does this. There's peer community in zoology that does this. And then there's also the journal eLife that does this now. And it's becoming a trend now of making a pipeline from preprint to journal, and really getting those links strong and making sure that when research gets submitted to a journal, it's in a good state and it's robust. Even if you don't make your work available as a preprint, you may want to still submit it to a journal. And if you're interested in submitting to journals with no additional fees, these are called Diamond Open Access journals, in that they're free for readers and they're also free for authors. They're not so well known. They don't tend to be published by major commercial publishers, but I've given some examples here. The Conservation Evidence Journal, Conservation and Society, iForest, Myers and Peat, European Journal of Taxonomy. They're really good journals. And I think in future we'll see more journals published like this, because the act of publishing and the work of publishing, the labor of publishing does cost money. So don't make the mistake that of thinking that all these journals are completely free to run. It's just generally that there's another source of money being paid to help run them, like libraries behind the scenes. So it's free for authors, but libraries and institutions and endowments are paying to help run these journals. But that means that when the author comes to submit their manuscript to these journals, they don't have to pay anything. So they're quite convenient. If you're interested in the ethical side of the conversation with regard to journal publishing and publishing your research, I'd really recommend this paper that was published in Conservation Society. It's called Ethical Publishing in Biodiversity Conservation Science. It also comes with a database that it scores about 400 or 500 journals relative to their kind of ethical publishing scoring scheme. It's a really interesting look if you are trying to decide where to submit your research to. Another means of making your research open access is to choose an APC-based journal, whereby when you submit to the journal, you have to agree to pay the publisher a charge for them to do the labor to make the work open access. And the interesting thing about APC-based journals is that the amount that they charge really varies depending on the particular journal you choose. So my advice here is, if you do choose an APC-based journal, is to shop around and think very hard and very clear of whether it's really value for money. Because some of the open access journals out there that choose to charge APCs really have very high prices. And they really are prices. They aren't necessarily the cost. And so that I'm using words very specifically there. The difference between a price is that it's what a business sets, and that includes their profit margin. And for some of these journals, they may be making a 40 or 50% profit margin. The actual cost of academic publishing tends to be usually much lower per article. So a lot of the commercial publishers are choosing to set very high prices in order to make themselves a profit. So yeah, shop around with your different options and consider whether you even need to pay an APC at all, depending on how you want to make your work open access. Another thing I should state, given that Arcadia again is the funder of the Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes program, is that we really don't care about this thing called Journal Impact Factor. Journal Impact Factor is a proprietary metric which is sold by a company called Clarivate. And in certain departments, in certain universities around the world, they really worship this thing called Journal Impact Factor. But they are really silly numbers. They are statistically illiterate, they are proprietary, they are irreproducible, they are negotiable, they are gameable. Some people really choose which journal they publish in by the journal impact factor of that journal. And what I'm saying is that you shouldn't do that. Because it's just silly, and it's really distorting the market for academic publishing. Lots of the academic publishers are setting their prices relative to what their journal impact factor is, and so it's really distorting what academic publishing is relative to what academic publishing should be. So I just want to give you all confidence that Arcadia is not seeking for research to be published in journals with a high impact factor. And Arcadia does not use journal impact factor at all in our assessments of how well grants are doing. We don't use it. So from our perspective, you don't need to care about journal impact factor. Your collaborators may say something different, but that's your collaborators. Another thing that we really care about at Arcadia is rights retention. So as part of our updated open access policy, we require authors of Arcadia funded research to do rights retention, to retain their rights. Now, the actual process of doing rights retention is quite simple. Whenever you submit your manuscript to a publisher or to a preprint server or wherever, you just need to include this magic text in the acknowledgement section or in the funder information section. Just say, for the purpose of open access, the author has applied a Creative Commons attribution license to any author-accepted manuscript version arising from the submission. And what that means is that the publisher cannot take away the copyright from the authors, that the authors always retain the copyright to their version of the work, which is very important because that enables them to then place a copy of their work without the publisher branding, without publisher logos, in an institutional repository to make it immediately open access. So just summarize some of the points I've gone over. Arcadia funding of the Endangered Landscapes and Seascapes program and all grantees of EL and SP must comply with the Arcadia open access policy. This is available online. The URL is embedded there. I believe these slides will be distributed to all attendees after the call. If you have any external collaborators in your research projects, then please tell them about the Arcadia open access policy. Any research conducted using Arcadia funds must be made open access, and we're really serious about that. Please include the rights retention statement in all submitted manuscripts to help you do open access, to help you retain your rights to do open access. And I would strongly encourage you to think about uploading a preprint of your research to a preprint server, but that's not strictly a mandate. That's something for you to consider. You have the option of how you make your research open access. You can do it via a repository, via a preprint server, via a Diamond open access journal, via an APC-based open access journal. That's your choice. Making your research open access does not necessarily require the authors to pay a publisher. It's your choice. I've got a kind of bibliography here of further reading, which will be distributed with the slides. But I'd also like to talk a little bit about emerging best practice. So as I understand of it, where you are in the cycle currently, you may be looking to publish something soon. But if you were earlier on in the process of research, earlier on in the research cycle, you might be looking at getting your experimental design peer reviewed. And that's what peer community and registered reports does. What they do is they encourage researchers to upload the methodological details of their proposed experimental design, and then you submit it. It's a bit like a journal, but it's a journal just for your methodological design. And you submit your methodological design before you've collected any data. And this is really important because often I've experienced when I've been peer reviewing papers that the methodological design is fundamentally flawed. And when you get to a normal conventional kind of journal, it's kind of too late to change the methodological experimental design. And you end up having a very awkward peer review experience because there's nothing the authors can or want to do to change their manuscript. They just have this flawed experimental design and you just have to kind of deal with it. Whereas actually we could be doing much better science if we actually had our experimental designs peer reviewed first in kind of a two-stage process. And then after having our experimental designs reviewed, go and collect the data and then go and peer review again the entire article. So I just flagged that there as something additional to think about for you. And I'll stop there.
Thank you both, Martin and Ross, for really, really helpful and clear presentations. And I think their value will only grow in the future. We'll, yeah, as I say, keep both the recording and the slides as a resource to share, both with the people here and people who weren't able to attend. I've had a few people already ask for recording, and I think as people come to write up their results, they'll want to refer back to it. Yeah, thank you so much for really brilliant talks and for giving up your time. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, do let us know. I'm happy to put you in touch with people. Otherwise, great to see you all and have a nice rest of the day.